And a shout out to everyone who's attending. I can see very, very familiar names. And yeah, thanks very much for joining us. We're 3 minutes past, and so I would suggest we give it a go. To just welcome you to this webinar. This is the second of a series of webinars that Oxford Netzero is hosting. There are about, I think, 3 or 4 that will be run, I think, over the next 2, 3, 4 weeks in the run-up to COP27. And so I'm really excited that we're able to talk about everything related to net zero. And today's session is on net zero in Africa. And so, George, would you please put up the first slide, please? Yeah, so again, I'm really excited to have you joining us for this webinar. So just first slide, please. So we've heard about debates that relate to net zero globally. We've heard about what net zero should mean for the global community, but we've also seen debates emerging in relation to how net zero should be approached or should be structured in Africa. But this is mostly due to the global momentum on net zero, but also due to the discussions on net zero in Africa, and also because this year we're having an African COP, and which we hope that will shed light on African priorities, will advance conversations on African priorities, but also will help stakeholders both in Africa but also globally to understand how Africa should be engaged in the global discussion on net zero. And over the past year or two, we've seen state and non-state actors make public commitments on how Africa should engage with the net zero agenda. But and we've, as I said, we've seen debates coming up on how Africa's low historical emissions and how Africa's energy transition should determine Africa's approach to net zero. And here at Oxford Netzero, together with our research partners, we've been doing research on equity and justice in net zero, and we focused on whether and how the net zero framework can be a means for ensuring justice and equity in developing countries. Some of our most recent work is on net zero in Africa has been on how on what commitments non-state actors are making, and so we thought we would host this webinar to kind of just present to you some of the findings we're getting from some of the research, but also to kind of to open up that discussion a bit more broadly, so that we can engage with some of our experts on the continent on what they think net zero should be and what they are doing on net zero. And so we have 4 exciting speakers today, and I'll introduce them to you. But first of all, I'll introduce myself. My name is Jessica Mukoti, and I am a research fellow at the University of Oxford. As I said, we lead research. I lead, myself and a few other colleagues. We do research on equity and justice on net zero. And we focus on emerging economies and developing country, and some of our ongoing work at the moment is on Africa. But the speakers I've brought in today are really exciting. I'm kind of very excited about what we'll talk about today. And so let me just introduce them to you. Our first speaker today is NJ Ayuk, who is the executive chairman of the African Energy Chamber, and he's also the CEO of the Pan-African corporate law conglomerate, St. Sharon Law Group. He's the author of Big Barrels, as well as the Amazon and Wall Street Journal's best-selling Billions at Play, The Future of African Energy and Doing Deals. His experience includes advising major companies and governments on energy issues and investment strategies. We will hear from NJ about in another 20 or so minutes. Our second speaker is Rachel Akosua Antwi, and Rachel is the group head of sustainability, environmental, and social risks at EcoBank Transnational Incorporation. Rachel is a seasoned investment banker. She is a media commentator on sustainable finance topics in Africa, as well as she's also a non-executive director for the Center for Environmental Rights in South Africa. Rachel oversees the bank's global climate, sustainability, environmental, and social risk commitments and initiatives. She develops strategies and policies in collaboration with the bank's board. She also advises on sustainable finance to guide the group in achieving the sustainable development finance goals, in achieving the sustainable finance goals. Our third speaker is Felix, who is a professor for environment and development at the Copperbelt University in Zambia. He is also a chief technical advisor for EnviroSmart Solutions in Zambia. His research focuses on human-environment interactions. He also focuses on links between livelihoods and environmental change. He also does research on science, policy, and environmental governance to advance sustainable development. Felix was a lead author for the most recent IPCC report, sixth assessment report, and you'll find his work in chapter 9 and the cross-chapter paper on tropical forests. And then last but not least is one of our research collaborators, is Anne Cabot-Alsua. She is the co-founder and practice director of the Responsible Finance Initiative at the University of Pretoria. She is the RFI is part of the Gordon Business School, and she is an investment and research professional with more than 30 years of experience in managing assets globally. The assets that she's helped manage have very specific outcomes and mandates. Before joining RFI, Anne spent over a decade as the head of research at the Alexander Forbes Research Institute in Johannesburg. But at RFI, Anne works to empower economic agents to effectively allocate and mobilize capital to meet the development and economic growth imperative of African nations and regions. And doing that within the framework of the SDGs. So, we have, those are speakers. They are really interesting. They have very interesting backgrounds, and they have very concrete, work on net zero. And I'm really eager to hear from them today, and I'm sure you are too. And so, Anne, Felix, Rachel, and NJ, thank you for joining us today. I'm really grateful to have you for this webinar. I'd like to remind everyone before we begin to please mute your mics unless you're called upon to speak. But also, we're recording the session, and so we plan to post this on our YouTube page. And so, if you have, if you're unhappy with that, you'd only come on air when you're asked to speak, and so maybe just type in your comments or questions. Talking about quick questions and answers, so we have a Q&A function somewhere on your screen. We are monitoring that, and so just post your questions there, and a member of the Oxford Netzero team will pass the questions back to me, and I'll post them to the speakers. And so I think maybe we should get going. So first, let me just summarize what we've done on net zero and net zero, particularly in Africa, and then we'll bring in the speakers to respond to that, but also talk about what they think is important for net zero. Next slide, please, George. So net zero essentially comes from the recognition that the world globally, we must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees relative to a baseline temperature of 1850, the year 1850. But according to the IPCC, stabilizing temperatures to 1.5 degrees will require that we make sure that our carbon dioxide emissions reach net zero. And net zero means that we need to achieve a balance between the emissions that humans, or anthropogenic emissions, so we reach a balance between the emissions that we're putting out into the atmosphere and the ones that we're actively removing from the atmosphere. And this net zero balance that we're talking about must be achieved by 2050 if we're to have a very good chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And this also means that to limit warming to get to 2050, we must peak our emissions by 2030. And so that is a very, very quick, intro to net zero for those who are new to it. But we have also observed next slide, please. We've also observed a very huge adoption of the net zero framework for climate action. And so net zero is becoming a dominant framework for climate action. And about 2 or 3 years ago, in the run up to COP26 and afterwards, we saw a lot of actors making net zero commitments, both governments and non-state actors. And a recent stock take that was conducted by my colleagues here at the University of Oxford with the research partners found that there was a steady increase in setting of net zero targets in national legislation or policies in 2022 as compared to 2020. That means that there's a very, an increase in net zero target setting. But also the research found that that GHG coverage of current emissions by countries had also increased. And so setting of targets corresponded to an increase in the greenhouse gases that were covered by those targets. And so there's a 65%, there's like from 10% GHG coverage in 2020 to 65% in 2022. They also found that about a third of companies who are considered to be the largest publicly listed companies, according to the Forbes list of 2000, the 2000s list, they found that a third of those companies on that list had some form of emission target. And so we had targets relating to net zero, emission intensity targets, emission reduction targets. And so about a third of those had emission targets. But you'll also notice that if you look at the graphs on your screen, if you look at the figures on your screen, you'll notice that while over 20% of countries with net zero targets and about 7 to 8% of cities with net zero targets are from Africa, very few African listed companies are found to have net zero targets. And one reason for that would be like, they're not on the 2000 list of largest publicly listed companies. And so when we saw this, we were quite curious. We were wondering, so does that mean that, well, African companies are not, are not that big, at least compared to other companies, but what is the status of net zero target setting on the continent? And so we went out and did research. Next slide, please. And we focused on Africa, mostly because I'm African and I'm interested in what happens on the continent, but also Africa has one of the lowest historical contribution to greenhouse gases and hence global warming. And according to the IPCC, and this is from the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, summary policymakers, Africa has historically contributed to between 7 to 8% of historical GHG emissions between 1850 and 2019. And that's about, so Africa has also contributed to about 7% of total carbon dioxide emissions between the same period. And a very small proportion of that, about 2%, is from fossil fuel and industries, but also, and then a significant part of that, about 5%, is from land use change and forestry. But then if you look at it, on the other side is that Africa is also is the continent that is most affected by climate change. It has a very high level of vulnerability, but also very low resilience. And so any pathway for addressing climate change has to address the vulnerability, the resilience, but also ensuring that the continent transitions to sustainable development outcomes. And so we're interested in finding out how the continent can engage with net zero, but also, and a starting point for us was to look at how companies, because companies do drive economic growth on the continent, they drive climate action, they drive sustainable development. And so we were interested in how our companies performing in relation to net zero or emission targets. Next slide, please, George. So we tracked about 250 largest companies by market capitalization, and these are publicly listed companies on the stock exchanges on the continent. And this is based on ranking by the African Business magazine. And so most of the companies that we tracked are registered in South Africa, in the South African Stock Exchange, but others, most of them are in Morocco, Egypt, and Nigeria. But sectorally, we found that most of the companies that we tracked were those in the financial services sector, because they're the largest companies on the continent, but also the largest companies are from other materials that deal in other non-fossil fuel materials, but also within the food and beverage processing and construction sectors. Next slide, please. And so we found that 127 of the companies of the total of the companies that were analyzed, so we had a 250 sample, but 127 of those had some form of target. About 50 of those had net zero targets. That's really interesting. And most of the companies with targets had end dates for 2050. Just a few of them had 2060 targets, but it's quite interesting that most of them had either 2050 or earlier. But also most of these emission targets were set between 2020 and 2022. And so we see kind of the setting of targets corresponding to the global, global charter about net zero. And so companies in Africa are responding to that global movement to set net zero targets. And when we looked at the sectoral distribution of companies against types of targets, we found that a large percentage of companies that operate in the media, communications and data center services sector had net zero targets, while those in other other sectors like other materials and financial services had a smaller percentage of companies that set net zero targets. Next slide, please. So under the governance and CDR, and so first of all, let's talk about governance. Those companies with net zero targets or those companies with emission targets had these targets set kind of embedded in their corporate strategies, and so it means that they are they're embedded into their governance structures, which means that companies will actively work towards implementing them. A few others, about 7 companies, had self-declared to have achieved their targets. But also in relation to CDR, which is carbon dioxide removal, which is a very interesting thing that I thought I should present to you. And so while many companies that had targets did not specify whether or not they would use carbon dioxide removals, there are some, particularly those with emission reduction targets. And so remember, there's different types of targets that companies can set, but companies with emission reduction targets indicated that they would use carbon dioxide removal. And most of these removal targets were associated with nature-based removals, such as forestation and soil carbon enhancement. It's really interesting, when you think about the natural capital on the continent and then companies committing to removing emissions through the nature-based removals. And so based on this analysis, next slide, please, George. So based on this analysis, we see an emerging trend in the adoption of net zero, in the adoption of emission targets, particularly net zero target setting. It's quite impressive because when we started this, we thought we would not find net zero target setting on the continent, but we see that there's an increase, there's a trend where companies are opting voluntarily to set net zero targets. But also we understand that, and we through our research, we believe that African non-state actors looking to make net zero commitments should balance between development priorities and the climate ambition on the continent. So the continent, and particularly most stakeholders on the continent, recognize that Africa will need to be part of the global transition to a future where there's low emissions, because further warming will affect the continent more. And so net zero targets need to kind of be aligned with these dual priorities, and that can be through through making commitments that contribute towards generating green growth opportunities. But also we find that net zero is important if it enables a divestment from fossil fuels that will limit and avoid stranded assets. And so in this case, because there's a global movement away from fossil fuels, there's need for companies that do kind of make a very good commitment to transition to clean energy. But also important is ensuring that commitments by these companies emphasize on the need, but also take action on ensuring that there's investments in resilience and adaptation. And here's kind of a very broad overview of the work that we've done. And I'd like to bring in my colleague and our research partner, Anne, who will talk about what this means for financial institutions. Anne, please.
Thank you, Jessica. You're probably wondering why we're switching now to financial service companies, as opposed to going to the companies themselves. And I think obviously the reason why is because somehow we've got to be able to fund these transitions. And so financial service industry sits at the nexus of this, of getting the funding. But let's, George, can you put that last slide up? Because I want to show something to everybody. The slide after what Jessica talked about. Now, next slide. Your last slide. Last slide. You're going backwards. You're going backwards. You're going backwards. Remember, George, the slide you added on at the very last second. There we go. There we go. Okay, so if you were sitting in our spot, which is really in the institutional investment spot, and you're an observer of what's happening here around these net zero commitments, and I think as Jessica pointed out that there is the financial services industry front and center on this discussion. I think the thing that made us all really sit up and sort of in a sort of state of shock was after COP26, when Mark Carney said that he already had been able to secure $130 trillion in commitments from financial service companies. and this represented 40% of the world's financial assets, to trying to resolve the net zero challenge. And we sat back and said, how on earth could he possibly make that kind of a statement? Because first of all, whose assets are these? And I think this is a very important discussion, because if you look at the breakdown, and let's go right into the Africa institutional investors, why is it that we care about these institutional investors? Well, because even in Africa, they represent a lot of money. There's over 1.1 trillion in pension funds. Now, these numbers are really approximate, very difficult to get a handle on, but 1.1 trillion in pension fund assets. And insurance companies represent about another half trillion, excuse me. And then you have the banks with their tier one capital representing another 135 billion. I might be corrected later on by Rachel on that. So there's money in them thar hills, as they say. But notice, and notice as well, that the big signatories coming out of Africa tend to be financial services companies. They might be asking the question, why would they be signatories? Well, we have until 2050. We may not have figured things out at this particular point in time, but there's money in them thar hills, and there's money to be made here. So either I'm going to help the funding, or I'm going to teach people what they need to do in terms of that. That's my job as a financial services entity, is teach people how to deploy assets so that intention can translate into impact. So let's actually challenge that question and ask the question, how much can we depend on this sector to do this? And understand, look at what the bank's top tier one capital is. The number of institutional investors in here that can actually directly impact change by choices that they make in terms of who they fund and how they fund are really a very small portion of this. The rest of the money is in the hands of people who actually have to adhere to mandates that they're given by members of pension funds, investors in life companies, and therefore the challenge of translating intention into impact is about 10 times more complicated than people imagine. So 2021, as Jessica pointed out, and 2020, people were starting to make these commitments. They thought, sure, we can get this figured out. After COP26, when the institutional investors got together and you got the Paris-aligned institutional investor protocols and the Netzero Asset Owners Alliance putting together sort of the whole framework for how do you invest in this, I think we all sat back and said, holy mackerel, this is going to be a lot more complicated than people ever imagined it was going to be. And it's complicated because you're solving for two things at the same time. You're solving for the funding of that liability that has been, you've been entrusted to manage by the pension fund, by the insurance company. But you're similarly also trying to do that with some kind of impact. So your optimization framework suddenly shifts from risk and return to risk, return, and impact. Now, technically, that's a massive challenge. And technically, it demands a massive cultural shift for the entire industry. And what the different participants who were institutional investors understood is that if they were going to do this and meet these targets, they were going to have to literally change everything from the ground up. They were going to have to start identifying what the targets were. Not a simple thing. We're still in the process of doing those things, setting those goals. We needed to create a framework that allowed the actuaries that sit in these businesses to be able to manage the trade-offs. And that required that you needed to get data on assets, and data historically had always been on listed assets, and most of these listed entities, most of the opportunities for transition were sitting in the unlisted space. So how do we start modeling those, additional elements to get to a sense of what the strategic asset allocation should be? How do we create a benchmark that's constantly change and recognize that you're meeting every 10 years different targets, and how do you reflect that? And only when you have that do you have the ability to create a kind of a risk budget that you can look at your whole book and ask the question, how much should I put into each project, and how much will allow me to meet both this dual funding requirement and the impact requirement. So that is the global challenge to begin with. Now let's translate that into the Africa situation. And the Africa situation gets complicated even further, because it presumes that there are capital markets that are developed enough that you can actually look at these opportunities to invest in. And the problem is you might have 14 stock exchanges that are part of the sustainable initiative, stock exchanges globally, but there's only really 2 stock exchanges that have more than 100 securities in there. There's only 1 stock exchange, South Africa, that has more than I think 50% turnover. And most of these stock exchanges, and this is why Jessica wasn't able to find under the listed space any kind of numbers of really significant African countries. Most of these stock exchanges represent opportunities with multinationals or dual listings from other countries. So you cannot take this tremendous amount of money, over $1.5 trillion worth of assets, and say, where do we put it? You can't put it into the listed space. And that's the space that investors are comfortable with, because at least it's regulated, at least it's not subject to corruption. So you have this translation problem, which is complicated by the fact that 1, you don't have the capital markets that you can work with. 2, you've got a regulatory change that's happening in this continent, where people are moving from what we will call defined benefit sort of models, where the government or where the corporates that have these institutional assets take all the risk, and you're moving into what they call a defined contribution retirement funding space, which means that the investor takes the risk. Once the investor takes the risk, that creates a massive problem in terms of what you can invest in and what you can't. So in the case of Africa, just to kind of sum up, because I can hear Jessica getting very anxious here about where am I taking this discussion. You have a situation where you've got a regulatory framework moving in one direction, but you've got capital markets desperately trying to evolve to be more functional here. And being able to move that money into any kind of viable space where it can have an impact is going to be years off in terms of the discussion. So we have to do everything that institutional investors globally have to do. Plus we have to develop the capital markets. Plus we have to rethink our regulatory framework. And plus we need the instruments. And if you look at the $1 trillion in instruments that have been raised globally in things like green bonds and what have you, Africa represents 0.1% of those new listings. So we don't even have the instruments here. Now, I've only just started, but Jessica's going to cut me off and move me on to someone else. Okay.
Thank you very much, Anne. I mean, whatever Anna said is a conversation that she and I have had a few times, and so thank you very much, Anne, for for putting that out. And I'm really eager to hear from the panelists, but also from the people attending. But before we do that, I'd like to bring in Felix. Felix, we know that any commitments on net zero in Africa by businesses, by any non-state actor, will be driven by national level policies. And so just pulling up from our work, that's whatever what I talked about earlier and what Anne had just said, but also our work together. What do you think? What would you please talk about how the net zero commitments by businesses can align with these priorities? In fact, are businesses going the right way? Are governments thinking something else different? But also, what is your experience so far based on what you've done on net zero at the moment?
Thank you so much, Jessica. So when it comes to issues around net zero, or generally how governments in Africa positioning themselves as regards to addressing adaptation and mitigation, it is important to note that African countries are guided mostly by the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, where governments have made a number of pledges And I consider these pledges as being very ambitious. In the case of Zambia, they're pledging to reduce emissions from 25% to about 49%, and 5% being business as usual, and 49% being significant investment. Other countries like Namibia are looking at reducing emissions from 89 to about 91%. Guinea is looking at reducing from about 17% to about 17 and 49%. Nigeria 20 and 45%. So the higher percentage is actually what they're pledging to do if there's significant reduction. So when you look at the policy network and the discourse, there isn't much actually mentioned around net zero within the policies, but actually you can actually see certain activities that have been planned that are aligned well within the net zero agenda. And the review of all the African national determined contribution, they show that 258 adaptation options that have been spelled out, which translated to 6% are around ecosystem-based adaptation. So we're looking at things like afforestation, we're looking at agriculture, sustainable land use management, and so on and so forth. So you can actually clearly see that from the mitigation side, agriculture and intervention around that is coming out very strongly, and also from the adaptation. So from adaptation, you're looking at agriculture being about 40% of the strategies that have been filled out, issues around water management being at 52%, disaster risk management, and others. So I think one of the key things just to note is that when you look at net zero commitments, African countries have not yet done that, as they are guided more by the NDC, but it's also important just to note that within the NDC, we actually clearly see a very good line in what net zero stands for and what is provided for within the nationally determined contribution. And I think as a government, as companies pledge, I think their commitment net zero, I know of a number of banks that have done that, and some of these international banks are also operating in Zambia. I think there will be need to ensure that there is a clear alignment between the various commitments as well as the NDCs, because the NDCs are now like guiding what countries are doing, and countries are
I think
monitor which these people get greater.
Sorry, Felix, you kind of froze there for a moment. Did I cut you off?
Oh, I'm very sorry about that. Should be a connectivity. So what I'm trying to say is that the NDCs are guiding adaptation and mitigation options, and there will be need for the commitments that companies have made around net zero to be realigned or be aligned with what governments are doing, so that at the end of the day they achieve the same goal. It's very clear that if we look at net zero and this is scaled up and companies pledge and they live by the pledges, I think this will actually even help the adaptation and mitigation options that countries have set to achieve. I think with those words, I'll raise my case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felix. So we've had Anse talk about financial institutions and what their mandate is and what they can actually do and how that kind of plays out with the commitments that they've made. And then Felix has said that any action on net zero or emission reductions on the continent actually rests within the NDCs, which are very 2030 based, but while net zero commitments are long-term. And so we have to think about how those kind of, push against each other and how they play out. And here is where now I'd like to bring in another perspective. So, kind of very much linked to the NDCs, but also to financial institutions and financing and net zero is NJ Ayuk, who will give us a very interesting perspective on what he does. And so NJ, you've been a very big advocate for Africa's right to energy, to a just energy transition, and energy is a very significant part of the emission targets of all African countries, but also the business that we've tracked. And so we expect that debates on just energy transitions will be very central to not just your work, but also to discussions at COP27. And so tell us what you think about what companies are doing, what financial institutions are doing, but also what Africa needs to do in relation to net zero, but also in achieving its just energy transition pathways.
Jessica, thank you so much. And it's such an honor for me personally to get to talk to this audience. And who would have thought that a little country boy like me will be talking to anyone at Oxford. But I would start this with a little bit of a different shape. I think there is a big discussion on Africa how is Africa going to meet these net zero targets? The first zero we have to think about is 600 million people without any access to electricity, 900 million without any access to clean cooking, most of them women. That should be Africa's first net zero target. But even when you move from there, we're still looking at an oil and gas industry and coal industry that is still has the potential to be vibrant in this in our continent. But bigger than that, we still are the continent, as it was earlier said, 2.7% greenhouse gas emission. And we get in countries which have really done so much, putting all these NDCs on African countries. And when you talk about adaptation, how is Africa going to meet that? The adaptation funds never came. But then we go in a sense where we're looking at this time with our energy security. That should be Africa's biggest priority. And that biggest priority should be getting people out of energy poverty, getting a just energy transition that will still require us to use our natural gas to really industrialize. We're not against net zero targets. The wealthy countries should decarbonize. They should meet their targets rapidly. They should even bring it down to 2040. But Africa needs to industrialize, and Africa has to produce gas as much as possible to get us there. But again, the oil and gas industry that operates, it has an amazing market to do something that is really, really transformational, using the right kind of carbon capture technology, because these industries that have driven humanity have created so much change and have driven a lot of things that we have seen. They should be going on an overdrive. And you see that with a lot of Western companies operating in Africa using carbon capture technology. Is that enough? No, you need to go, you need to do more. You need to super drive, you need to get more going. But then we need to really start cutting out on the hypocrisy that we're seeing. United Kingdom, for the first time in 30 years, is opening coal-fired plants, same as Germany. Yeah, when we went to COP26, I was right at COP26 with the majority of them, and they had all these pledges, and they forced African nations to take all these pledges. And then 2 months later, Germany went out opening coal mines, building LNG terminals. Norway is going to drill, Norway is going to give up 2 licenses. The UK announced that they're going to do a licensing around this. US opened all federal lands for drilling. Australia, and on and on. But then you want to turn to poor African countries, and say, shut down your pipelines in East Africa, shut down, Mozambique, one of the poorest countries in the world. Well, we got these targets for you. Let you stop, you leave it in the ground. Namibia, leave it in the ground. Nigeria, Senegal, and all these poor countries. I think it's something as we go through this, we need to look at it. And it's something which we see the financial institutions have been so unfair with all these NDCs, and we need to be very careful. They say gas is green right now in wealthy countries in Europe, and they're going to finance it. How the hell are you going to get to your net zero targets when you finance in gas, you call it green, but for Africa, you would not do it. And then you tell these poor people to take on this commitment. Where are the $100 billion climate adaptation funds that you promise every year? I went to school in the United States, and I'm a big fan of Dr. King. Dr. King's, in his March on Washington speech, he said a Negro came to Washington with a check marked insufficient funds. The African today is being told and is being pushed and is being given a check marked insufficient funds, but not just a check marked insufficient funds, but a check marked insufficient funds with mandates and threats. And unless we start to turn around and make this about persons, about people, and get those who polluted the most to keep those targets, then we're going nowhere. I might not be the most popular here at Oxford, but I do think that we have to really think different. We have to think critically, because it's about people, and people do matter. Thank you, Jessica.
Okay, NJ. I think to the audience, you can see the story we're trying to tell through the webinar. Started off by saying, we thought no one was doing anything on net zero, and then we found that a few people were making targets, and then we talked about financial institutions, and then NDCs, and NJ comes in with his really thought-provoking statement about energy and justice and net zero. I'd like to bring in Rachel, who works with a financial institution. And so, Rachel, you work with an institution that has demonstrated that decarbonization is not just in its operation, but also in its lending. And you, based on the profile that I just read, that's what you do for your employer. But what role do you see African financial institutions playing in this, but also just going beyond those institutions? Do you agree with what NJ just said? Do you agree with what Felix and Anne just said? And what do you think the future is for net zero on the continent? You're on mute, Rachel.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. I think I agree with all of them to a large extent. They've all made very, very good concrete points, including NJ. From EcoBank, from where I sit, which is the largest Pan-African bank in Africa, we are in 33 African countries. And certainly our vision is to promote the economic and financial integration of the African continent. This means that net zero will impact us greatly. From both a financial and economic perspective, the African countries are going to suffer. We certainly as an organization would not also exist. And it is in our interest to promote the sustainability of the, of the growth of the African continent. Now, as an organization, we recognize our role in this as well, and our responsibility. We want to take a leading role in driving the net zero discussions and also setting the right policies and targets. We have sort of started making some bold commitments from our side where we are beginning to set net zero targets. It's still rather in a very robust stage in terms of, are we going to meet 2050 or are we not going to meet 2050? Again, some of the key things that have come up again during conversations with clients and also just ministers of governments in the continent is one of the key things that NJ has raised about how can we make this a just and equitable transition in Africa? Climate justice is quite important, and the right to development in African countries is also very much important. Pushing a single policy on African countries is a dangerous approach, in my opinion. There are many corporations in African countries that want to, recognize our role in the just transition and net zero, but they want it to be fair. Africans want it to be a fair and equitable transition. And what does that mean for us? It means that do we put all our resources in the ground and go and borrow money from the global north and be charged exorbitant interest rates? Those are some of the conversations that we're having. So what are the solutions on the table for us? And some of the things that we're looking at that we think that are more pragmatic and also can help solve some of the issues that NJ and the other panelists have raised, as you know, even NDCs are not enough, is can we, as an organization, promote the carbon take-back obligation, which I think is the most pragmatic solution that we have on the table at this moment. There are a number of solutions. For example, we also believe in renewable energy, nature-based solutions, and all of that. We want to have it all on the table as a financial institution that cares about the growth of Africa. Have it on the table and promote it in a way that creates a win-win solution for all parties. So for me, I believe that for us to be able to have an equitable and just transition, we have to look at all the solutions. And that is important by looking at the carbon take-back obligation. It's quite simple if you look at it. If you take away all the noise, you polluted it, you clean it up. And the cleanup is not supposed to be done mainly by African countries because we know that they didn't do the pollution, but you have a lot of multinational organizations, the oil and gas companies that can come in to build the carbon capture technology that can bring, they have the money and the power to do this. So these are some of the conversations that we are having internally through dialogue with our clients as well. We do not believe in divestment. We don't believe it's the best way. What you're going to do if you keep pushing one policy approach in African countries is you're going to, build conflict and resentment towards the West, towards the global North, if I may say. Some people are even calling it, climate colonialism, climate commercialization. It is really unjust if you look at the way that the market is looking at it. African countries don't seem to have a voice at the table at the same time. We haven't been invited in the right rooms to voice our opinions and also to put solutions on the table. So as an organization like EcoBank, we hoping that we can push this in conjunction with, organizations like Energy Chamber, African, other ministers and governments to push a unified African voice at COP. That we recognize our responsibility. Nobody's running away from it. But as NJ has said, we live in poverty. It is unfair to ask us to just, dump all our, leave our natural resources in the ground, go into the market, borrow. There are many arguments for that. But we believe that a more pragmatic solution, which is simple, is to bring in technology to help us to meet the net zero commitment. If we are willing, if the market is willing to bring Africans along and hear our voice in this to ensure that we meet a target and ensure the survival of us and many generations to come, then we need to take it seriously. So that is where we stand at this moment. And that is where I think if we really want to, prevent conflict, prevent resentment towards the global North, then this is what we're doing, because many people in the market are feeling squeezed through the financial markets and in other ways as well. And we want to, alleviate energy poverty, as NJ has said it, but we also promoting a sustainable and just transition for all Africans, and we're part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That is very much that answers my question. And so I'm wondering whether we can just bring in Felix and Anne again. I mean, so just before we bring them back in to the audience again, now that's the complete story. And the story for us is that at Oxford Netzero, we're really interested in understanding what equitable and just net zero looks like. And for us, it's engaging with these very diverse opinions that are not just rooted in policy, but also in science and politics. We're interested in understanding what different institutions understand, what different institutions need to achieve net zero, whether they support it, whether they would like, how they would like net zero to look, but also how net zero can work for emerging economies. And on that note, let me just bring in, maybe go back to Felix again. Do you have any response to what NJ and Rachel just presented? Do you have anything to add? Felix seems to be unavailable at the moment. So Anne, please.
I can certainly jump in here.
Go for it.
I think when we first started doing this investigation, I sort of jokingly put a cartoon in at the front of my presentation that was talking about carbon tunnel syndrome. And it showed the fact that, the whole net zero concept, without looking at all of the issues that Africa has to contend with. Forget just the energy one. So if you're looking at the asset owners and the institutional asset owners, their constituency are saying, solve our problems, not the global problem, solve our problems right here. But I think another more important point is that I've been here for 30 years in Africa, and I've watched how the financial services industry has evolved. And what really alarms me and disturbs me profoundly is that those countries that are considered the winners, like South Africa is having the most evolved financial ecosystem, are actually incredibly lucrative at creating good financial returns for the financial services industry, but do very, very little in terms of being able to help develop solutions for Africa. And I think that's where the mindset has to change. And I think one of the points I wanted to make is that I think the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, have an important role here and in facilitating this stuff, but it's going to demand it's going to demand collaboration among African countries, which is not something everybody loves to do, to get these things, these financial systems functioning in such a way that we can address some of the issues that NJ raised, not just net zero. So it's incredibly difficult to get someone to commit to net zero when, as you know, as an owner of assets, you're sitting there with a multitude of challenges on your plate.
Mm-hmm.
And no way to solve those challenges given the nature of the capital markets and the regulatory environment. So
that's good, Anna. And I think kind of, yeah, just bring it back again to the financial institutions. And if everyone remembers, they're kind of the largest group so far. And in our thinking, they kind of have that very important role in tipping the scales in whichever direction that the continent takes on climate action, but also sustainable development. Felix, if you're back, can you do you have any response to what NJ and Rachel just said before we open it up to Q&A? Okay, Felix is not here, and so NJ just raised his hand up. Before we go to NJ, I'd just like to acknowledge that we have lots of questions in the Q&A. NJ, please come in, and then we'll have the Q&A section, and I'll read out the questions after that. Yeah.
Jessica, I think Felix knows I'm right, so he's so scared to say anything, but that's probably he has internet poverty now. But you know, in response to this, we need to really, and Anne made a point with more for financial institutions and everything. You need to go towards the free market approach. You're not going to get through this by aid. I think we're tired of aid. I mean, how much money you spend aid? You guys are from Oxford. You know the numbers. $800 billion or even $1 trillion. What have been the results? Anshin says doing the same thing over and over. You know what happens? We have to look at market-driven policies. This is a continent that's going to be 1.4 billion people, 1.4 billion consumers. So whether you want to talk about leapfrogging, we want to talk about having stranded assets and all this coming up in the future. I'm not too worried about stranded assets because Africans are going to be using that natural gas and that oil. I'm worried about stranded lives like the ones I met in Malawi that don't have a shot, those young girls that don't have a shot to read and study. And I think at the end of the day, you are going to really see if you don't focus on really driving up the private sector, using free markets. But yes, we have some things to do in Africa, like engage things around limited government and really engage our financial institutions to play their role. But if the idea is about choking up African financing into anything that is not dictated by the Western countries or Western agenda, then you're going to have a problem. Right now with financial institutions, the multilateral institutions, you don't even have so much money going into Black-owned businesses in Africa. Black women are still the last hired and the last fired. If you look at the African Development Bank stats with financing going even into renewables, you've seen very little go into Black women and even Black men in Africa. So when you see the new system that is tinged with colonialism, it really, really calls on us to look at this carefully. We need a just energy transition, not an energy transition. It has to be just and it has to be inclusive. And African states that would try to move into this Western narrative that has nothing to do with our people, some of us at the chamber, we are going to put energy on the ballot. We can no longer accept that 600 million people should be going without electricity. And even those in countries like South Africa have no access to electricity. So maybe it's time for us to put energy and energy finance on the ballot. I bet you, those of us who stand for African energy poverty will win all the time.
And maybe NJ, just while you're still here, I mean, so you're advocating for an energy transition that is very much rooted in oil and gas. But how do you think? So we have a question here that's asking about the deep-rooted corruption on the continent, but also how these investments actually do translate into sustainable development. Do you think just having a position like much more investments in oil and gas will translate into the sustainable development goals that you that the continent has committed to?
No, I mean, when you have friends like Abdul who tries to educate you all the time, you do change and you do improve. It's not oil and gas. It's something I do call triple C's. You got to bring in a whole lot of different things. It's a combo. It's an energy mix. So what do, you bring in renewables. You invest in natural gas, the cleanest form of fossil fuels. You phase out coal. If you phase it out, you don't do what Germany is doing and the UK is doing right now. They're blowing up the air on steroids. So what you do is that you phase out coal, you bring in gas, and what do you do with gas? What do you do with gas? You use gas to bring in renewables into the game. So you have this mix and you're playing with some blues because you're dealing with different things. It's sustainable, it's better, it's cleaner. You keep your greenhouse gas emissions lower. You know, if you produce all the gas in Africa today, your greenhouse gas emissions is only going to go up by 1%. So you're still going to be somewhere around 3 or 4. So I think we have to be very careful, but even bringing renewables, they are very expensive. We've got to find ways to make it cheaper. That's why in Africa today, we're embracing green hydrogen. When you talk about corruption, corruption is bad everywhere, but this is where you need to get young people and all these smart people around Oxford. Don't just sit there in those nice fancy rooms drinking your latte and almond milk and giving lectures to Africans on how they have to behave, but you need to get involved. You need to get engaged. And you need to be part of the solution rather than giving out lectures. And how do? You get on the ground brick by brick every day. And why not? You guys run for office and take out some of these big issues, then sit down, wear your nice bow ties and expect that the world should be saved. Turn it around. Our past, our fathers saved and changed our continent and beat out colonialism. They didn't have no email, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have TikTok and WhatsApp. Here you are in Oxford with the best education in the world, with 2 emails, TikTok, Instagram, IG, Twitter, and everything. You can't even get a meeting together and figure out how you can beat corruption, and you just blame it on corruption and the oil and gas company. You got Glencore, one of the most corrupt companies in the world in London. How many of you have gone to their office and match on? So don't blame me. I'm doing my part. If you don't like it, you joined me so we could figure something out. But we're not going to get to get into net zero. We got to take care of 600 million people with no electricity. We need to take care of their lives. It's not acceptable. It's a human rights issue. It's a human rights issue, and that should be an African priority.
Okay, for the record, shots have been fired. And so NJ, we will take this to the field. And Rachel, do you have a response to that?
This is a good one. I mean, NJ has definitely fired some shots at all of us, Jessica, but I can see you are taking a stand in Oxford, and Oxford is doing quite well. But what I support, I concur with AJ on a number of things, but I think what we need to bring out more clearly is, while we want a good energy mix, we also need to remember the science is that, you know, what we put in the atmosphere now, cumulative, will remain there for a long time. So there are some solutions, like I said. I honestly believe in the cover take back obligation. It is the only way. We need to push the global north to do this. It is not for African countries. If we have a multinational organization that is coming into the oil and gas industry, they should be building these technologies to allow us to use a natural oil and gas, as NJ has said. I mean, this is one way we can clean up. It's like you pollute in the river, or you pollute in someone's house and you just don't want to clean it up. We can solve this climate problem in a very simple way if we stop all the noise that we are making and really listen to the real problem that we have. As you said, if you really want to bring Africa along, if you really want to get to net zero, then it's important for us to listen to the African voices that are speaking, bring us into the room. So at COP27, we're going to be there. African Energy Chamber is going to be there. And I think one of the things that we're pushing is to bring African leaders together to advocate for one position, to bring a voice to the room and say, this is our position. We do not believe that, we should just leave our oil and gas in the ground, but what are the solutions that are available? So hopefully we can work with organizations like Oxford University. We're already working with the African Energy Chamber and the rest. And we can make an impact, because you cannot do it without us. And there's no leapfrog. I mean, I know NJ mentioned it. How are you going to leapfrog? Where is it in history that you've seen anybody leapfrog? It has to be fair. It has to be equitable. It has to be just. And to get all parties to come to the table, I think we have to look at win-win solutions for us. Thank you.
Okay, Rachel has brought it back to the issue of agency, and maybe just to ask Felix and Anne, we've seen the numbers, we've seen corporations making net zero targets, and we have a few countries on the continent that have also made net zero targets. Are they doing it themselves, or is someone else making those commitments for them? And that's a question from the Q&A box. Anne, go for it.
Do we stay with, is Felix still out of the commission? I get very cynical about this stuff, in the sense that there's a whole population out there making a lot of money in this whole net zero thing. And it's people are making a lot of money consulting, people are making a lot of money in terms of creating sort of financial solutions and what have you. I think the important point is to ask the question, what's going to move the dial and what isn't going to move the dial? And one of the conversations I have with regulators who are trying to figure out, particularly in the financial services area, to what extent do we go and regulate this to sort of push the agenda? I say, just be careful what you wish for, because you're going to create a lot of costs against people's savings to achieve what? I mean, I haven't really had a chance to spend the 3 hours that I need to explain how little impact a lot of these long-term savings can have because of the nature of the markets here in Africa. But I worry very much that we're playing to a piper's tune that is not going to be able to have a consequence. I think the discussions that you're having up at policy level with countries and with multilateral development banks and whatever, that's fine. But and those conversations need to continue in terms of what's the best way to crack this stuff. But to expect us to be able to delve into people's long-term savings to solve this the way that, the current structure is hugely problematic. And I really strongly urge regulators on this continent to resist the urge to just align themselves with the EU and whatever else to sort of say, let's just demand that these funds attack this problem. Because there's a wonderful quote that basically says that we're flying the airplane while we're trying to build it. We still have not been able to do that very critical point that I made. How do you translate intention of what you want to do with these assets into an impact? And that we haven't solved. So hands off is sort of my view.
Okay.
By the way, having said that, I think we have a huge problem in that those funds can't solve the other problems for Africa. Like we can't solve SDGs because we don't have any ability to invest in our own selves through these mechanisms. So I think that's number one priority. Make the assets work for the people whose savings they represent.
Okay. Working for the people that the savings represent. Kind of just pulling up from there. Sam Fankhauser asks, and this is a question for all of you, including Felix, who's still out of commission. Sam asks that Africa is quite diverse. Could you provide a bit more granularity and the different challenges and starting points for the different countries in addressing the climate challenge, but also in meeting the net zero, the fitting into the net zero narrative? And maybe we'll just kind of go Rachel and then NJ and then Anne. You're on mute.
Sorry, yes, Africa is very diverse. If you look at, South Africa, most people concentrate on South Africa when they look at the African continent. But if you look outside South Africa, there are a lot of countries that are way poorer than South Africa. For example, I'm based in Lomé, which is in West Africa. It's made up of, I think, just about 8 to 10 million people. And Lomé is not a very well-developed country. It's a French-speaking country. And so to bring in the net zero conversation in Lomé, which is very underdeveloped compared to, many European countries, and even emits less CO2 emissions, it becomes very, very challenging to ask them to set net zero targets, even though they are willing to come to the table to sort of set up a reasonable target for African countries. So yes, we are very diverse. Each African country is looking at this climate transition issue. And we recognize that we have a problem. We recognize that we are part of the solution. But I think there is a unified message that we are hearing on the continent because our challenges are very similar. And that is, we want this to be fair and equitable. No matter our diversity, I think our problems are very similar. I mean, in terms of the science, we see what's going to happen to us. So the solution that we see is also very, very similar. And from an African perspective, that is why we're promoting from one voice. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. And NJ, where do you think Africa will get the money to invest in this just energy transition that you're talking about? And do you think that there should be conditions attached to further investments in oil and gas?
Well, I think if we're going to get to net zero targets, I think one of the things I agree with Anne is a lot of people be making a lot of money in this. So the first thing you do, you fire the consultants, fire all those big name consultants who are putting out plans. These are philosophers in their closets writing up plans that nobody even knows. They don't even believe in it. They're taking templates and really putting people at risk. How do we finance our transition? It's going to come out of fossil fuels. It might not be what a lot of people want to hear, but it's still one of the biggest revenue generators for most African countries. But then this is a good and amazing opportunity for us to change the game. We can't do more of the same. So definitely you want to basically maybe limit financing into places where you say some of the financing would have to go into communities where you deal with community trust funds, where you work on community infrastructure like mini grids or create youth power projects, but also deal with issues around healthcare, around environment, that mandates different things around carbon capture technology. So you've got to find a balanced way to approach this. You can't just find this big think, okay, we're going to take something that's worked so well in Scandinavian countries or in California or in Oregon, and we're just going to implement it in Africa. It just wouldn't work. I mean, at the last COP, the only African country that had a plan to net zero by 2050 was one of the poorest African countries, the Gambia, because they were being pushed to do that because they needed aid. So you're seeing a lot of African countries being pushed to say, if you need aid, we're going to tie you to this plan. And that is a problem. So because we're not letting markets decide, you would have to let the markets decide. You're talking about financial institutions. Investors are going to have to drive to what makes them the most money. But again, at the same time, getting to net zero targets, we have the abundance, whether when it comes to renewables, whether you have to look at hydro and different things. But you cannot put a stranglehold on financing and then make it, and then think that people wouldn't push back. There is a pushback around the continent on this stranglehold of financing because people are tired of aid. You would have to use natural resources, but you have to do it responsibly. You have to do it well because that is the future.
Thanks, Sanjay. So we have Felix back, but Felix, before we ask you to say something, let's just circle back to Anne, and then we'll have Rachel say something, and Felix, as you prepare. So Anne, Rachel, and then Felix.
I was going to ask more of a question of our energy experts. It's something I don't really know quite all of the different dimensions of, but isn't the issue not about, isn't the issue really who owns these, who should make the money from this, and where does that money go? So the issue isn't, do we do fossil fuels? Do we start mining the rare minerals that exist here that are actually going to be the minerals that people are going to need to be able to get access to be able to get the longer life batteries and what have you. Whatever the direction we take, have we really resolved who owns those minerals, and where does that revenue go to, and how do you make that equitable? Is that not one of the starting points here? And I don't know what the answer is, but I'd love to hear what the energy experts say.
Rachel, take that. Or yeah, let's hear from Rachel.
I missed it. I got a call. So please, if you can rephrase the question for me, or NJ can take it, so that I don't waste time.
Let NJ take it.
NJ, take this one. I'll come in.
And the resources belong to the people. And that's the fundamentals of where we have to come. We have to start with. All natural resources belong to the people that inhabit there. But we have to also know they have finite resources. And as finite resources, you might not be getting it back. And if you base that and you have a governance system that is in place that recognizes that, then you've built a basic framework for you to really start meeting, at the end of the day, those sustainable sustainable development goals, which everybody wants. You'll be surprised. The energy industry is one of the big industries that advocates that. But the big problem you have with that end is you find yourself today where it's fossil fuels. That's the problem. We're not looking at the issues around mining in Zambia, in Sierra Leone, in the Congo, because that is fancy, or it's critical minerals, or that's fancy. At the end of the day, it's all natural resources. How have we engaged natural resources from a governance standpoint, from a people-centric standpoint? How have we engaged that? And if we don't come with that fundamental principle that these resources belong to people and it has to go to the benefit of the people, of course, I'm a capitalist. I want those that invest in to make money. I want to make a lot of money, because at the end of the day, free markets are still the best path to prosperity. And we shouldn't use resources to play resource nationalism or play some kind of game. But the problem always has been billions of dollars that have gone into many states, because money that goes to politicians is not your money. When money that has gone into many states have not been used well. That's why we believe in creating more market principles, trust funds, really get money to the communities and let them build themselves up, rather than, I trust people, not politicians.
I don't think we've solved that problem, though. I don't think we've done a good job of solving that problem. That was my point.
I also think so.
And now, so two areas I want to explore here. Rachel about commitments to net zero, but also Felix about minerals. So just to start off with Felix, because you haven't spoken for a while. Felix, we've been talking about, we talked for the last 2 weeks about minerals in Zambia and the DRC. How do you think African countries should position themselves in relation to the minerals they provide to the net zero movement?
Thank you. Thank you so much, and apologies. I think I kept on trying to trip off. But I think let me start by speaking to my earlier presenter who said that we trust the politicians, well, we trust the people more than the politicians. And just a reminder that politicians are people. So basically, when people have power, the way they think and position themselves becomes very, very weird, if I can use that term loosely. Now, when you start looking at minerals and the position of African countries, the DRC, Zambia, and countries with rich minerals that are obviously important for the net zero transition, mostly in the energy and looking at renewable energy. there is a lot of potential, but Africa has fed too much on potential, where we've had potential for a lot of things that has not been realized. So before we even step into, I think, the net zero, we need to ask ourselves one simple question. How are African countries now benefiting from their mineral resources or other resources? And how can this be enhanced? But all in all, within the net zero debate, if governance systems are really put in place that protects our countries, I think there is a lot of potential, because these countries are rich in terms of minerals. But I think we still need to look at there are a lot of gaps, like, for example, taxation on minerals, legalities. The DRC is just an example. My next door neighbor, a country that is rich in resources, but unfortunately there's war, civil war, and all these. So in terms of if you were to look at proper governance systems put in place, fair markets put in place, I think these African countries that are into mining, I think will play a huge role when it comes to I think to the net zero debate, mostly within the renewable energy. And again, I must also mention that sometimes people have been now looking towards enhancing maybe traditional leadership, because there's a belief that traditional leaders are better placed to and they are more connected to the local people. But unfortunately, I've seen the trend changing. We find that even the traditional leaders now, quite a number of them that I know of, have actually just become like any other politician, because of the value of resources that they would get from maybe certain transactions. So I think we need to actually strengthen governance systems, and the potential is there for net zero and the mining and our countries. But I think what we need to do, look at is what governance systems should be there. How can we protect this? How can we be very deliberate about this? How can we ensure that those who are marginalized are not marginalized? How can we ensure that there's even sustainable mining? Because that's the other thing. There's mining, but is it being done in a sustainable manner or not? So these are some of the things we need to look at. And again, we want our local, we say resources belong to the local people. Yes, they do. But unfortunately, the local people do not have the capacity, technical and financial, to harness these resources. So you have your diamond in the ground, but you're not going to get an axe and a hoe to remove them. There's need for serious investment into this. So these are the things. So even the investment that comes in must be fair investment that will support the local people. So governance becomes a critical issue. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. And so for two questions for Rachel and NJ. There's a Swahili proverb that says that, I'm just translating it, if people are talking about it, then it actually exists. In Swahili, it says, lisemalo lipo, even if it's just one person saying it, then it's a thing. And so, I mean, you've talked about the net zero transition, which is kind of pulling it in a different direction for, not just completely, phasing out oil and gas, but phasing down for oil and gas. But we have institutions that have committed to phasing out oil and gas. And so the commitments that I showed you earlier. And so what is it? Do you think that we should take those commitments as they are, or should we take them with a pinch of salt or a pinch of paper, depending on what you prefer? And what are the challenges? Like if anyone here is looking to engage with African stakeholders or institutions on net zero, where should they start?
I would say,
thank you.
Rachel, go ahead.
No, you go first, NJ. I'll go after you.
I come from I'm an optimist by nature, but on that, I would say take it with a pinch of salt. And if the salt is not salty enough, find some salty salt and take it with a pinch of salt. Because at the end of the day, the markets are still going to drive this. And you would still see, and I think the current crisis in Ukraine and Russia has shown us that all these commitments could be thrown out the door for energy security. And when it comes to affect you, it's always good when you to give lectures to others. But when it really hits you, then you throw everything out because you got to take care of citizens. But when it comes into that, we got to be very careful how financial institutions really target this. You got to find the right balance. You got to be pragmatism has to play in this. We can't just go with a radical extremist move because we're sitting on some 20-feet floor in an office and we think this is the way the world moves. That would be a poverty in ambition. What I mean by this, you would then seed financing on and control with governance and a transition to countries where free markets are not really their principles, and net zero is not really there. You would see for example, Africa, most assets then will be controlled by China and Russia. And then you go figure how you go figure out your net zero when China takes over most of the assets and China becomes the biggest financier of your oil and gas in the continent. So you got to find that rightful balance and maybe tamp down on some of the rhetoric and the extremism, because that's the way that would be the way forward. That would be the way forward. But you need to find that rightful balance. This idea of pointing fingers at Africans and say, if you don't do this, and you're warning them, when you do that from a financial perspective, they would turn to the other side. And sometimes they will say the dark side is not always a good side.
Rachel.
Thank you. It's always hard coming after NJ. Yes. So from, you spoke about commitments and all of that. Yes, I think commitments are important. A lot of financial institutions, banks have set commitments, but we're looking at meaningful commitments. Are they meaningful? Are they measurable? As an institution, EcoBank, we're working on setting our targets. As I said, we're having really robust discussions, whether we're going to, where we're going to be 2050, 2060, we're in 33 African countries. But I think the best approach for us is engagement with our clients, with all our stakeholders, to draw a line in the sand. But we cannot commit to net zero without, like I said, the technologies and the rest of them. What I believe should happen is that the global north must be forced to set more meaningful targets. A lot of the targets, people have done it just as a sense of, it's like a fashion now, everyone just sets in targets, but as your research shows, are they really meaningful? Do they really have interim targets? Are they really measurable? So we need to force the global north to do more. The global south, we're going to do our best as well, but the global north need to do more. They need to come to the table. They need to set more targets. They need to help with the technology, and they need to help with the transfer of knowledge in the financial sector as well. So yes, we will be setting up commitments, and we hope to work with the University of Oxford in setting up some of these commitments that, the targets, and working on a target that is equitable. Because as you see, in 33 African countries, it is really difficult. I think India has set up 2060. I don't know of any other African country that has come up with a target apart from maybe South Africa, but it is important that we have these discussions. If we really want 2050, then we need to be pragmatic. So hopefully we can work together with the University of Oxford and all our stakeholders to set meaningful targets and come up with a firm commitment somewhere next year after COP, once we've added our voice to the conversation. Thank you.
Speaking of firm, Anne and Felix, 1 minute each.
Okay, look, I in no way do I think we should stop. I think doing what we're doing, which is questioning everything, which is challenging everything that we're hearing in terms of the international sort of pressures on Africa. And I think we need to keep pushing and challenging back again. I think we have to also, what's impressive is just how much has been achieved in terms of trying to pull everybody together around a common narrative. That is just unbelievable. But the reality is we haven't even begun to touch upon what are the consequences of doing this to humanity, to the people. I'm a development anthropologist, which means you look at what happens if you push this button and create change. What are the knock-on effects throughout the system to the other buttons? And when that I haven't even heard that in the discussion. So we haven't heard about it globally in Africa. It's going to be 10 times worse because the people are really at the core of this whole thing. So we can't stop, but I think we need to always be on the lookout to challenge every assumption that's being made about what we can do to get this done. Just keep working on it.
Felix, you have the last word.
I think when you look at, I think a lot has been said, and my strong feeling is that as African countries plan to adapt and as well to the climate change, as well as look at the NDCs and other alternatives, I think it would be important to see how the net zero agenda could actually be looked at. And then there's also, I think, the issue around investment, because when you look at the NDCs, they're all clear. They'll tell you we can reduce by 20%, and then maybe 50% is significant investment. And I think this is where I think the two can actually link up, so that even these companies that are committing can actually do that. The commitment, for example, to reduce oil and gas, like the leader said, to zero, sometimes I laugh because I ask myself where I live in Africa and how far we are from technology and city developments. And then I hear some commitments being made elsewhere. And I'm very sure that those commitments will not be achieved, not in my lifetime, and maybe in the lifetime of my the second or third generation. So I think it is important to be realistic. It is important to also note what is it that we can contribute to the agenda of African countries, but also what is the level of support that we actually need. And I must mention that there has been very poor funding or support by private sector companies, I think, to African countries when it comes to adapting, investing in adaptation and mitigation options. Thank you.
Well, I have nothing else to add. I mean, I do research on equity and justice in Netzero, and you've now seen what we are working with. It's very, very passionate groups. It's very passionate individuals. And as I said, our work on this is just starting. The work that the analysis that I presented earlier will be ready just before the COP. And so have a look at the Netzero website, Oxford Netzero website, to see the work that we're doing. Felix and Anne and ourselves are also doing some very interesting work. And so do keep an eye on the Oxford Netzero website. I really hope I've done justice to our speakers. If I haven't, we can, as I said, we can take it outside. NJ, thank you very much. And I am truly honored that you all found time to speak to us today. I really want the African voice to be featured in conversations on Netzero, and this is a really good start. We've managed to keep most of the audience that started, and so that's a very huge achievement on my part. And so thank you very much to the audience who've been here today. Again, do reach out. My email is on the Oxford Netzero website or the somewhere on the Oxford website. So do reach out if you have any questions. For those who had questions here, we will capture them and we may reach out to you individually to answer them or engage one-to-one. George, the last slide, please. So the next webinar is on the 21st of October, led by my very good colleague and friend, Kaya Axelson. The topic will be the path to net zero integrity, from voluntary best practice to policy. She has a very good lineup of speakers, and so please do sign up. It will be in person, but also virtual, and so you can engage in whichever way you deem fit. And that's it. We're definitely half past, and so thank you very much again. Thank you again to our speakers, Felix, Rachel, Anne, and NJ. I owe you, and you know what I owe you, even if you refuse to take it. And so thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.